Good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I'm Lissa Muscatine. I'm one of the co-owners of Politics and Prose, along with my husband, Brad Graham, who's right there. And on behalf of our great staff here, we welcome all of you to tonight's event, which I have been excited about for so long. And I'm so glad all of you are here, in part because it's a great book, which is always fun to talk about, and in part because it's a great person who wrote it, my former colleague and dear friend, Dan Baer. And I'm really excited to have a chance to talk about this book. It's, I think, a very important book in this moment. I really urge you all to read it. Don't be afraid, even though Dan is super scary smart and very experienced in the questions about the world. He has made this book so clear, so compelling, and so easy to read, and yet full of nuance and historical context that really helps articulate this kind of roadmap for where this country can go in this sort of depraved moment we find ourselves in. So Dan, welcome.
Thank you.
Let me just say a couple of things for those of you who don't know him. He is a vice president at the Carnegie Endowment for research, policy research.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Policy research and the Europe. Mm-hmm. I've gotten something wrong here. Okay. Right, yeah. I have it right here. I should have just looked. He is a former ambassador. He's a US Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in the Obama administration. Before that, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, also in the Obama administration. And he has been the Director of Public Higher Education for the state of Colorado. He's even been a Senate candidate. And I should just, in Truth in Advertising, explain how we know each other, which is that we had a forced partnership many years ago, which turned out to be one of the great gifts to me.
And for me.
No, for me, really. Dan and I were joined together with the task of working on and writing Hillary Clinton's testimony in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when she had been nominated to be Barack Obama's Secretary of State. And we spent about 6 weeks, I would say, or a month working on it at very late hours, some comical situations. And we got to know each other pretty darn well.
We worked on it down to the last minute. We pulled an all-nighter the night before, and Lissa never let me forget the fact that I brushed my teeth and spat out of the car window on our way over to the Capitol. So,
well, the funny thing about it was we had to, this is way more detailed than any of you wants, but it's kind of amusing. We had to convince the Secret Service to let us go in my car in the Secret Service package and follow the about to be a Secretary of State, driving through the streets of Washington to make it to a 9 o'clock hearing on Capitol Hill. And the Secretary Clinton's, not yet Secretary Clinton's housekeeper gave us little toothbrushes and toothpaste because we had been up all night and we were pretty pathetic. And Dan literally was brushing his teeth in the passenger seat of my car as I was trying to keep up with the Secret Service motorcade. So we were bonded for life based on that. Yes. But the point is that I just realized in about 3 seconds how smart this man was and also how good he was. This is just a person of tremendous decency and compassion and humanity that goes along with your big giant brain. So it was a gift to me, and it has been ever since. So let's just start with the first question, which is, why did you write this book?
I wrote the book partly because I was worried, well, partly in response to conversations I was having. You mentioned that I had that I ran for Senate. The fact that I am not a US Senator tells you all how that ended up. But during that campaign, I got the chance to talk to a lot of people around Colorado. And I found a lot of people asking a question, a different version of the same question, which is it still worth working for what we're working for? I go out and I volunteer, and I'm worried that nothing ever changes. And I worried that combined with kind of a narrative that you sometimes heard in Washington or in the establishment that, America was on a trajectory of permanent decline and that the Chinese were going to eat our lunch, that the combination of those two things was potentially really, really, really dangerous. And I didn't believe that either of those things had to be, I don't diminish the challenges we face, but I don't think it's the case that we have to accept that we can't make change. And I don't think it's the case that America's on an inexorable trajectory of decline. I do think that we have to make different choices than we've made collectively, but I think there's a way forward.
Before I forget, I think one of the most interesting and important points of your book, which is not a major point, but it's there, that really struck me, is that democracy's imperfection actually is what drives its progress, right? I mean, you say this. And so we can look at the news today. Has anybody noticed what happened in the House of Representatives today or yesterday or at the United Nations or, go down the long list? And you say people have this sense that these problems are insurmountable and immutable. And yet you're absolutely right. Democracy isn't perfect and never has been, but it's these imperfections and challenges and things that go wrong that should propel us to make change.
Propel us forward. And when it's working right, the magic of democracy is not that it is perfect, but that actually things can change without having all the institutions scrapped or having revolution. You can get evolution without revolution. And you're quite right. I mean, I think one of the things I say in the introduction about the problems we face is that if all of the people in this room made a list of the top 10 problems independently right now, of the top 10 problems that America faces, 80% of those problems would be overlapping in some way, maybe articulated in different ways, but we would agree on 8 out of the 10. Not only that, if we made significant progress on 2 or 3 of those 8, we would all agree that that was like a really encouraging move in the right direction. And so it does feel like we have unlimited, innumerable problems and that they are totally insurmountable. But if we start to break it down, actually, if we made some significant progress on a few of them, I think it would create the kind of inertia that leads to progress on the others.
Yeah, you say we're sort of in a state of polycrisis, but what we have to do is, instead of just resign ourselves to that, to think about polyprogress, that you can make progress on these various fronts that are often overlapping. And you make the case here of how interconnected these, especially economic and political challenges are. So the title of the book is The 4 Tests. How did you arrive at these 4? I just want to say, Dan points out, I think you point out in the book, or I've heard you say this, that the tests are not rigid categories. They're not meant to be, this is, everything fits neatly in this thing. They're really more amalgams, compendiums, and they're a way to organize the way we think about problems. And the tests are so original. I mean, I love the way you're presenting this constellation of both challenges and potential solutions in these 4 brackets that are, they're not so rigid. But tell us how you came to sort of do these 4.
The honest answer is that I was sitting down doing exactly what I just said, of making a list of what I thought like the biggest problems that America faced, or the biggest challenges that we face in terms of succeeding in the 21st century were. And when I looked at the list that I had made, those 4 kind of buckets emerged to me. And so, the 4 tests are scale, by which I mean dealing with the fact that, America is never going to be relatively as big as we were economically, as powerful as we were politically 30 to 50 years ago. Like, we're never going to be 40% of the global economy again. We're never going to be as dominant, or in the foreseeable future, we're not going to be as dominant as we were in the wake of the Cold War, when there was this unusual unipolar moment. So we have to figure out how to work and be successful in the world without those advantages of totally overwhelming scale. Now, we're still very big. We're by far the richest country on earth. There's a lot going for us. And so I think when people talk about our relative decline, they should make sure to remember our absolute strengths. But so scale is one, investment is one. Those two are more conventional, I think, kind of national security strategy frames. But the last 2 are fairness and identity. And those go really to the real challenges that we have at home. If we're going to be strong in the world, we have to address some of those fundamental challenges at home.
There's a very beautiful dedication in this book. Maybe you could read it and tell us a little bit of the backstory.
So, first of all, I loved working at the State Department. I loved my colleagues at the State Department. I have enormous respect for American diplomats. I had enormous respect for my colleagues from other agencies as well. But the book, in addition to being dedicated to my 3 nieces, which is perhaps the more conventional dedication, the book is dedicated to a woman named Stella Sears, who was my assistant for 3.5 years when I was ambassador in Vienna. And Stella is a member of the Foreign Service of the Office Management Specialist Corps. And she was born and raised in Moldova during the Soviet Union, and ended up marrying an American, becoming an American citizen, and joining the State Department. And when Putin invaded Ukraine for the first time in 2014, I had arrived at Post a few months earlier, and there was a weeks-long span during the early days of the invasion where I was on. The OSCE was the only international organization to send monitors on the ground in Ukraine, and I was negotiating that arrangement and then helping to implement it. So I had late night secure video conferences with the White House almost every night for weeks. And one night I was leaving at like sometime after midnight, and Stella was always there to make sure everything was working. And I said to her, I'm really sorry you've been working late so often these last few weeks. I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry for a lot of late nights away from your kids. And she said, never apologize to me. I am proud to have this job. I am proud to be an American. I'm glad to have a job with purpose. And I could be picking potatoes in the mud in Belarus for a living. Don't ever thank me for working hard. And I said, Stella, you got to hold me to a higher standard than picking potatoes in the mud in Belarus. Like, I got to do better than that. But it is, she's an immigrant who believes in America. And when I have found my own confidence tested in recent years, I have thought back to that moment. And that's why I dedicated the book to her.
Yeah. And I think the message, it's such a touching story. And I think the message is also, there are things worth fighting for, even when it seems desperate. And I think we can all agree it feels pretty desperate right now.
Not only are there things worth fighting for, but when you think about it, I talk to people who say, look, I think it's too far gone. I mean, the chances of our success are 1,000,000 to 1. Okay, maybe you're right that the odds are 1,000,000 to 1. Maybe I'm right that it's actually much better than that. But either way, what are you going to give up and let our children and grandchildren not have? I mean, there's no choice but to work for it.
Well, you say that very clearly in the book. What is the alternative? We can sit here and hem and haw about, well, the US could have done this or that. What would the alternative have been? And let's talk about American hegemony for a second, because you say a lot about that in the book. And you make the point that the standard and the metric used to be American political and economic domination globally was the only measure of success. That was what defined us as a country. That was what we believed enabled us to provide a good sort of secure environment for the citizens of this country, the people of this country. And your big premise in this book is, no, we don't need to be a hegemon. In fact, we can't be.
Right.
And we don't need to be. So can you talk about that for a second?
Sure. I mean, the we can't be is the most, being a hegemon is a good strategy if you can pull it off, but you got to be realistic when that's over. And I think their hegemons are particularly lazy strategists, whether those are monopolistic firms or countries that are used to being the most powerful countries in their region or in the world, as we were. You get lazy when you. I say, when you're playing poker and every hand is a full house, you don't have to be that good at playing poker to keep winning. We still have a strong hand, but not every hand is a full house. And what that means is that America, have to learn strategies of international politics that don't depend on hegemony. And that means that we have to depend less on coercion and dominance and more on genuine leadership and actually figuring out how to rally other actors around purposes that are good for prosperity and peace in the world and that will keep Americans safe and prosperous as well.
Yeah, you say we have to be better at convincing, not coercing. But what tends to happen, I think, and you talk about this also, is that instead of, if we can't be a hegemony, we then just default into isolationism.
Yeah,
and that's just overly simplistic. Okay, well, if we can't be the most powerful, dominating country in the world in every way, well, we'll just retreat from the world.
Yeah, and I don't know that it's even that analytical. And I actually have enormous sympathy for the emotional response that that I think drives certainly a lot of the isolationism on the American right now. Mm-hmm. Because I think, the world is a scary place. Mm-hmm. It's becoming more complicated. It feels like the problems that used to be far away are coming home to kitchen tables more and more. And there's a temptation to say, like, I just want to opt out of all of that. But of course, we can't opt out. The world is not going to go away if we become isolationist. In fact, the problems that we feel like might come to us will come to us quicker, and we will have fewer friends to help us deal with them. And so I understand the emotional response of kind of just wanting to withdraw, but it's not a good strategy. It won't be successful.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it is an ever more popular strategy in certain quarters, especially of the Republican Party. But what you do say that we can do and should try to do is you say, we want a world not that we control, but that is hospitable to the continuation of the American experience. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I guess there too, I'm trying to separate out, I'm trying to imagine a world in which, without American hegemony, we can still be confident in the future of the American experiment. And it's harder than the last time we had a major shift in international politics, when the end of the British Empire happened last century, and America was a scrappy, young, growing industrial country that was right there ready to catch the ball from the Brits. And so there was a handoff from one, and yes, deeply flawed colonial democracy to another. And liberal ideas had a guardian as international politics evolved. Right. There's no single actor today for the United States to hand off to. So we face a more complicated challenge where we have to build what I call constellations of cooperation around different global problems, and kind of hand off, be more comfortable being part of a board of directors on something than a CEO.
Well, you say in the book that the world doesn't run itself. And we have had these multilateral institutions that have been set up for decades. If anybody's been following what's going on in the UN General Assembly this week, and Vladimir Zelensky being so critical of its ineffectiveness, you quote, I don't know which French president it was, that said, NATO is brain dead. So we have all these structures in place that have been there for a long time. Are they just not working, or is it that we need an attitude shift about how to reconstitute them?
Kind of both. I mean, as somebody who was the ambassador to an international organization that operates wholly on consensus and included the Russian Federation, I know about how hard it is to reach consensus on everything. And, you know, these organizations are only as good as the participants in them. It's not a deep flaw with the United Nations Security Council that causes the United Nations Security Council to not be able to take decisions in the interest of world peace. It's a flaw with Vladimir Putin's regime, and often with the Chinese government and others who do not support actions that the UN should take to help secure peace in the world. I think we have to stay committed to those organizations. They are inclusive, and they are a place for us to make arguments. And over time, those arguments do have, maybe not every time, but over time, those arguments do have weight and do have an effect. I also think we're going to see much more of what we're starting to see. And, you know, the Biden administration has done several things that are examples of this, like AUKUS or the Quad. We're going to start seeing much more kind of flexible, I forget what they call it, flexible pluralism or something like that. They have a catchphrase for it, but we're going to see much more kind of innovation of identifying, either around certain issues, fishing in the Pacific Ocean or whatever,
or regions,
or regions.
Smaller regions, yeah.
We're going to see pulling together a group of countries around climate, a group of countries who are particularly interested in a particular issue or problem, and problem solving in those kind of new groups.
So just as a side question, when you were at the OSCE, did you practice this art of convincing and not coercing, let's say, with the representative of the Russian Federation? I mean, how did that actually play out in practice for you?
Well,
and did it give you ideas for this book, which I'm sure it did?
I mean, two things in practice. One, it was somebody on my team who came to me in the early days of the invasion in 2014 and said, you know, we could use a model like what the OSCE had done in the former Yugoslavia. We could have a mandate that would allow observers to look at the conditions, civilian observers to look at the conditions on the ground. The Russians were then spewing false allegations about terrible things happening in eastern Ukraine. There were terrible things that they were perpetrating, but they were spewing false allegations. And so they said, well, if they're claiming that all these bad things are happening, we should just take their claims and say we should send in an observer mission. And it was somebody on my team who wrote up the first mandate, and we negotiated, including with the Russians. And yes, they were caught out because they had been making all these complaints, and it looked like we were answering them with a solution. And so we did get something done, even with the Russians as they were invading another country that was a participating state. And then it became much harder to get things done after that. But over the ensuing years, there were weekly debates on Russia's invasion, and the Ukrainian ambassador and I would each speak, and the Russian ambassador would speak. And there are 57 participating states in the UN, in the OSCE. And let me tell you that the other 54 were on the side of the Ukrainian ambassador, not on the side of the Russian ambassador, whether they said so or not. Making those arguments, making people realize where principle is. Diplomats are people, and the message they send back to capital is basically that the Russian ambassador had no leg to stand on, that he was embarrassing himself, things like that. Then that is important in international politics, to try to continue making the argument on a principled basis.
No, you're making a really good case for why these very flawed organizations and institutions do still get some stuff done.
Yep.
Can we move to investment for a second?
Sure.
There's a quote I love in the book, which is you say that investment is a statement of interest.
Yeah, I mean,
I love that.
And a commitment to the future,
Yeah.
obviously.
Statement of intent about the future. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the core arguments of the chapter that is about what I call the investment test is that we have to not just tinker around with the dials, but actually recognize that the enormous technological change that we've gone through means that we have to invest in the American people in a way that we haven't done in the past. And again, look, in the last century, when the kind of first wave of the Industrial Revolution had ended, and we realized there was a realization, whether conscious or not, that people needed more education in order to stay ahead. We created public schools that went through 12th grade. We now need more than that. People need more than a high school diploma to be successful in the global economy today. And not only that, we can no longer afford to not be educating all Americans, because the scale problem means that we need everybody off the bench and participating. And so we have to massively invest in human capital. And that means not just education, but also making sure that people are able to work. That means childcare and elder care. Those are the things that are going to drive the American economy forward and maintain our strength in the world. And it's going to take a shift in the way that people think about, and there's nobody, some of this investment will come from the private sector, but there's nobody to kind of quarterback this other than the federal government. States will obviously play a key role. And so we have to have a mind shift that if we want to compete in the next 50 years, we have to invest in the American people in a way that we haven't done in the past.
You talk about the care economy. You just mentioned a couple of aspects of it. And that also hits on issues of pay equity and institutional sexism and racism in our economy, structural economic forces that work against the most marginalized people. And when I was reading that, I was reminded, I don't know if any of you read this piece about Katie Porter a couple of days ago, but she says in her book, being a real person and having a real life is in fundamental conflict with American politics. And, that is so apt. And it's a lot of what you're talking about. I mean, if you can't, why is our healthcare system, are the jobs so low paying? They're populated usually by people who are always at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Yes. And I guess part of the argument that I'm making is that, well, for me, it is compelling to have social and economic justice arguments about pay equity, or about closing the achievement gap in education, or about making sure that healthcare workers who are doing home health care are paid a living wage. The social and economic justice arguments are compelling to me. I also think that if you're not persuaded by that, you just have to believe in math. We will not have the kind of economic achievement that we need to have for America to stay strong if we don't invest in those things, if we don't solve those problems, if we don't take on racism. Like, we need everybody off the bench and fully in productive work. And we can't do that if we're held back by racism, sexism, et cetera.
But I think, absolutely. And I just wonder, though, if the biggest challenge of all isn't this sort of zero-sum game mentality, that you talk a little bit about that in the fairness section, but if I can't see the benefit of having well-paid healthcare workers and how it might redound not just on society but on my community and everything, it's going to be a hard sell, isn't it? Because all of these structural forces are at work to stop us from doing that.
Yes, and I think we have to break out of bad habits. I mean, two things on that. One, I think it's important that rich people in America, of which there are a great many, recognize that if America continues on the trajectory we're on right now in terms of widening inequality, the quality of life for their children is not, even if they're rich, is not going to be great either. Is going to be worse than it would be. They're going to, do they want to live like a rich person in Brazil, where they're worried about kidnapping we want to have a more equal society, a more fair society, because it will be better for everyone. Everyone will feel safer, more secure. It will be more possible to find a fulfilling life, no matter whether you are very rich or not. So, I mean, I think it's important to make the case to rich people that they also have something to gain out of this. And I forget my second point.
Well, you remember Bill Clinton used to always say, I should be getting taxed more. I'm only paying this percent, and he was trying to make the point, I'm wealthy and I don't pay enough taxes.
We are going to have to, there are only two ways for the government to invest money, and one is to borrow it, and the other is obviously through taxation. I think the kind of investment, I think there's a difference between consumption spending, which frankly tax cuts are in their effect, and genuine investment in the future of the American economy and in the health and well-being of the American people. And I think it is a fair argument, and we should have these debates in Congress about which kind of spending we're talking about, whether we're talking about consumption or whether we're talking about the kinds of investments that will pay dividends in the long run and that will leave all Americans better off.
Well, you make the point that we maybe shouldn't, I wasn't making the distinction in my own head just now of consumption spending versus other kinds of investment spending, but you make the point that why don't we just think of these things as investments, not spending?
Yes.
Right.
It's not spending in the sense of consumption. Yeah. It's not spending in the way that I buy a t-shirt that then goes away. Yeah.
But in the meantime, we can't even pass a budget.
Right.
And we are being held hostage by a, spineless, weak House Speaker who is now beholden to a handful of extremists and can't get anything done. So what about
I'm going to confess that I have started to feel sorry for Kevin McCarthy.
Not quite there.
I think, two things on that. One, there's no question. Think about what it looks like from other world capitals. Think about what it looks like from Beijing to see that the American Congress can't agree on rules to discuss a budget.
They've got the popcorn out.
Right, exactly. Part of China's strategy is premised on American decline, and this kind of political circus validates their thinking. There's no question that it's not good for us in the world because it doesn't look like the way that you want a grown-up country to behave. And it's not just this budget fight. It's obviously the fact that Congress has repeatedly failed to pass a proper budget for the function of the federal government. And not doing that means that you actually don't adapt your spending so that you are doing more investment, because what they do is they just continue the old budget. Well, the old budget probably wasn't great for 2017, but it's certainly not appropriate for 2024. And if we just continue what we were doing in the past, you never get the opportunity to innovate, to do things better. And so we need them to pass a budget. The other thing that I think, and this is part of what I talk about in the book, is we should recognize how deeply connected this kind of political circus and dysfunction is to, for instance, our campaign finance system.
Absolutely.
It is connected both to the fact that wealthy elites in this country effectively currently control the kind of makeup of the U.S. Senate, because money has become so important to electoral politics, particularly kind of the Senate is the sweet spot of where it's a very significant office, but it's not necessarily a national name, and so but you need statewide media and stuff like that, so it's expensive to run. And there's often when you say that, and it is true that the very wealthy are spending too much on American politics and buying power that way. The small dollar donors are not a perfect antidote to that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think people should be able to make small dollar donations, but the way that that has evolved, because so much money is required to run for an office in our country, the way that the small dollar donors have evolved is to create these armies of often fringe on both sides people. You know, we all get these fundraising emails and we think, who the heck does this work on? Like, why are there so many exclamation marks? And why are you using
like
hyperbole? Like,
almost.
yeah, I mean, like, well, both parties do it. And the answer is, it doesn't work on 90% of people, but it works on 3% of people, and they keep giving $20. And by the way, they won't let their, Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene vote for the rules to debate the budget when Kevin McCarthy needs them to do that. And because those people are more beholden to this army of people who like the theater and who give them $10 every month. And so, that is part of what generates the circus.
No, you're right. I mean, it's sort of a galvanizing factor of this kind of crazy hyperbolic insanity that we watch every day. And I'm sure we all do get the same texts and emails. And how did they get my phone number? And now they're calling me on my, it's relentless.
I mean,
and I think you have
a heart for the poor candidate who calls you, because I can tell you it's absolutely no fun and the worst experience.
Well, you also, in your own experience, discovered how hard it is to raise money. I mean, a lot of people were excited about you running, but it was, I mean, you saw how much money you actually were going to need to run a race in Colorado.
Yes. I remember my first meeting with Chuck Schumer, and as I left the office, his staffer said, good luck and raise $1 million in the next 80 days or else it's over. And, that's a lot of money.
Yeah. Well, I have a friend who was in Congress until a couple terms ago, and she was from a Democrat from a swing district, and she said she spent and she was in the House 4 hours a day. Literally 4 hours a day she had to spend calling people to raise money.
And by the way, that's 4 hours a day that she didn't spend legislating.
Exactly.
Which is what we want those people to be empowered to do.
That's theoretically. Okay, let's talk about fairness for a second, which you said is kind of an unusual frame, an unusual test for this, which I think is what makes it so interesting. We have a big UAW strike right now. We've seen a CEO salary compared to an assembly line worker salary at some, in the car auto industry. Thank you. And that's a very blatant, obvious example of not being fair, but there are different kinds of fairness that you look at. Can you explain a little bit how you think about fairness as a sort of framing point?
Yeah. I mean, I think whether you look at it in our politics, campaign finance, et cetera, if you look at it in our economy and who's benefiting from the vast dividends of new technologies, et cetera, if you look at it in the remaining barriers that, particularly for women and people of color. Again, my claim here is not that the social and economic justice arguments aren't persuasive, but they aren't persuasive to enough people. Right. And I believe that tackling those challenges will make America stronger in the world and better able to compete in the 21st century. And so what I'm trying to do is make the case that actually taking on fairness in our economy, our politics, our society, taking on those challenges of fairness will make us stronger in the world.
And part of that is updating, you say this a couple times in the book, updating the social contract.
Yeah.
And we do that by creating a more competitive marketplace.
Yes.
What are the other prescriptions?
We do that by investing more in people and having there be an expectation. I think it is reasonable for people to say, I am sharing a society with my fellow Americans. Mm-hmm. And I guess this is also a point that I make several times in the book, is that there's a fundamental choice that we all have to make, which is like, are we going to stay in this together? If not, then I think that's a terrible choice to make. But if we're going to stay in it together, then my success depends on your success. Mm-hmm. It is not a libertarian idol of kind of 17th century feudal farming where you can kind of be on the land yourself and it doesn't much matter what's happening 3 farms away. When I'm a coder, it matters whether or not I am embedded in a system where there are other coders who can, or I can teach younger coders or learn from older coders. I mean, you have to have for the jobs of the future, they are collective jobs in the sense that they benefit from networks of people who have those talents and skills. And so we have to recognize that, that we are all going to depend, I think, increasingly on how other Americans are faring for our, even as we look at our own success, however we define that in our journey, which of course is the last chapter.
Well, reading this book, I suddenly had this thought: maybe Gen Z is going to solve this. I mean, Gen Z seems, there's a great unionization effort across the country. There are climate activists. Bill McKibben just wrote a great piece about, the kind of energy behind the climate march recently in New York. There's just a lot more attention to work-life balance, quality of life, fair wages, fair workplaces. And
I mean, if you think I'm channeling Gen Z, I'm flattered because I've never felt so hip. But
no. Well, you're not that much older than no. I mean that seems to be where there is a lot of energy that's looking at things differently. It's not sort of accepting the status quo.
I think that's right.
I mean, Brian and I were talking earlier about whether the degree to which being an institutionalist affects the way we think about things. Do you think you're an institutionalist?
Yes. I mean, I used to say that I was an idealist, and Brian corrects me and says, you're not an idealist, you're an institutionalist. So, yeah, I mean, I accept the correction.
Okay. Because I think, we're all, certainly people who've worked in government and have been a certain generation, we're pretty institutional. But I'm thinking Gen Z's kind of like having different jobs and different career paths, and there's just a kind of a less rigidity maybe that might allow for looking at these questions differently.
Or another way of looking at that is that it is normal as generational change happens for people to examine institutions and think about what parts they want to preserve and keep and what parts need to be changed. And I think we are, for a host of geopolitical, economic, social reasons, going through a moment that is an inflection point in how people think about the way that society should be organized and governed. And I think that can be a good thing if we decide to make it a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same point you were making about democracy. Yeah. If democracy didn't have flaws, it wouldn't get any better. Yep. Because we wouldn't know what to work on. No, I get that. Okay, identity. And you say this is the toughest test. And you talk about the need for a thin, common American identity that doesn't supersede other identities, but it somehow galvanizes and brings people together. And I was just thinking about this, the degree to which party affiliation and partisan affiliation is so prevalent. For example, I think it wasn't that long ago that when there was a story in the news media about a judge handing down an opinion or weighing in on something, we didn't know who appointed the judge, and we didn't know what political affiliation the judge might or might not have, and we certainly didn't think it was going to influence the judge's judgment. Yeah. And now, every news story says, oh, they were appointed by Obama, they were appointed by Bush, they were appointed by whatever, Trump. And then suddenly we go, oh my God, that means that this judge is definitely in this mold. And this is how this case is going to come out. I mean, we were, those of us who were not on the Trump wagon were like fretting over Eileen Cannon in Florida and, reveling in Tanya Chutkan.
I think, so you are, I think, objectively right that especially in the last 10 years and really in the last 5 years, people's political party affiliation, to the extent that they have one, and I should note that a growing number of people are choosing not to identify with either of the two main political parties, which we'll see we'll see whether that continues. But party affiliation has in many cases become quasi-religious. It is connected to identity, not to an analytical frame about ideas for how the country should be governed. And I think that's not ideal because we need a basis for our politics that has some thin layer of common identity where we agree that we're all in the same problem set together. We don't have to ever agree on how we solve them. We can debate those endlessly, but we have to at least agree that we're in the same conversation. And the fragmentation is so deep right now that it's not just that people have kind of a quasi-religious identification with their party affiliation, but we've seen basically an epistemic schism where there are a large number of Americans who have a different truth than who have different sets of facts than the majority of Americans. 30% of Americans still believe that powerful Democrats were running a child sex ring in the basement of a pizza parlor. I mean, it's
also in Politics and Prose.
It's a different
sad but true.
It's a different world, and it's very hard. I have a line in the book where I say something like, when you're debating with your spouse where to put the sofa, and your spouse says that's not a sofa, that's a duck, kind of where it goes starts to lose all import.
Right.
And this is a kind of equivalent to that. You're like, okay, well, if that's where we're starting, I don't know how we get anywhere. I think the identity chapter people may find naive, but basically I tried to lay out, I do believe that it is possible, and I think liberal government, small L liberal government, depends on citizens having some sense of being in a common enterprise together and seeing each other as worthy of being in that enterprise. And I think we need to have a conversation. We can bemoan the lack of a common identity, and there's all the ways that we can point to it. But I think we need to have a conversation about what the basis of that could be. And so I put forward one idea for what the basis of that could be. I go back to the Declaration of Independence, not because I'm an originalist, but because I think the most beautiful and unusual term in there is the pursuit of happiness. It's the thing that isn't in the French Declaration. It's not in. It's a truly American thing. And the historians have looked at that term, and there have been some who have said, Thomas Jefferson. Normally, it was life, liberty, and property. That was the kind of standard liberal triad. And there have been some who said, Thomas Jefferson didn't want to elevate slavery and so used the pursuit of happiness instead of property. I think that's probably giving Jefferson too much credit, given his own personal history. There have been others who said it was just like a kind of folly that he put in there, which I think is giving him too little credit, given what we know about how careful of a writer he was. But I do think the pursuit of happiness is, and obviously it's not a guarantee of happiness, and I think it's quite clear that what Jefferson meant was not happiness in sense of being jolly, but probably what we today would call fulfillment.
Fulfilled, yeah.
And I think that saying that we should all be committed to the idea that every American should have the opportunity to make a life of her or his own choosing, based on her or his sense of what would be fulfilling, is a premise that that should be available to everyone, and that we should be able to persuade people is a reasonable basis for being in this project together.
It sort of does though call on the better aspects of ourselves as human beings, right?
As leaders should. I mean, we need some of our leaders to not just bemoan the problems, but also say, here's my idea for how we could move forward. And I guess, like I said, people may find it naive. There's more in that chapter than that idea, but I kind of, as I was writing it, I was like, you can't just say we're missing this thing. You got to say, like, for example, what if we tried X? And so that it's offered in that spirit. Not that I think it's the only or the best, but it's an idea.
Well, I mean, you do talk exactly. You talk about, you alluded to this, that we are in a sort of contest of identities instead of ideas, and I do wonder if one of the sort of fraying ideas is that did provide a sort of common identity was a trust and belief in our democratic institutions. That you probably were going to get a fair shake. You didn't really need to know who appointed the judge.
Yeah.
And that's fraying so much. And that's distressing.
That fraying is because I think, there's an idea that America is broken because that fraying in Washington has not done what it needed to do to adapt to this moment.
Right.
There have been numerous failures, both in terms of economic adaptation, the enormous consequences of the unforced error of the Iraq War that still permeate our politics, not only the economic cost, but the human cost. And it's because of failures like that you get a bunch of Americans who quite reasonably feel like they are having to divide up a shrinking pie. And when you do that, you definitely get the incentives for people to go at each other's throats. So
Yeah.
if we would fix the way that if we would tackle some of these fairness problems, we would create more possibility for people to see a win-win relationship with their fellow Americans, and less dysfunction in Washington would result.
I want to tell
Virtual cycle.
people that if you have questions, you should make your way to the front. And I just want to ask one more quick thing. I'm really interested. I want to talk to you about this a little bit more if we have time. This sort of appropriation of language and words in service of exactly the opposite of what you're suggesting
Yeah.
in your book. And one is, true American, true patriot, America for, all these slogans that have been appropriated by the far right. But you come up with this concept of patriotic empathy. It's such a nice idea. I mean, but it requires an opposite attitude.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to have a much bigger heart and have a much more open mind to be able to do that, to exercise that. And I just don't see where we can have that expectation at this moment in our political
I mean,
life.
it's certainly not on broad display in this moment. But again, I mean, I guess I think we should expect our political leaders to, to some extent, this is part of. Somebody could see this in what Joe Biden said was the spirit of his first campaign to restore the soul of America.
Yeah.
I mean, you could see it in that. But I think we need more leaders who are out there articulating the idea that even if we, and there are people on the right who would agree with this, that even if we disagree deeply, that we should try to think about where our fellow Americans are coming from in their anger or their grief or their sense of indignation, et cetera, and that there is a virtue in patriotic empathy, which is not to say that you have to adopt the views of your fellow Americans, but in hoping and expecting that on the whole, we're all doing our best to try to make it in life.
And we should be able to listen to each other. Yeah, no, exactly. Go ahead.
So I'm a retired career civil servant, federal civil servant.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. And you haven't really talked about government. And I grew up during the New Deal, when government was good. Government was doing what Lincoln said. Government was there to do the things together that we could not do by ourselves. And Ronald Reagan came in 1980 and said, government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. And there has been a huge shift in which now we blame the government for everything that's wrong with things. And the solutions for, say, childcare. The reason childcare workers don't get paid is because the people who hire them can't afford to pay them. They're poor people, and they don't have any money for other poor people. Like public education. Childcare workers need to be supported by public funds. That's the only way they're going to make a decent living, because the people who they work for can't afford to pay them anymore. Do you talk about that and how we can get things back together so that government is considered good again? I sometimes think that maybe a book should be called We've Met the Enemy and They Are Us.
I think you're going to love the book. So I hope you'll read it. And yeah, I mean, I think like the New Deal, we are at a point where there needs to be not just tinkering around the edges, but a step change in the way that we think about how we organize ourselves collectively and move forward as a society. And I think the combination of geopolitical and economic changes that we're going through necessitate that kind of evolution. And a lot of the things that you've just raised are in the book.
How do you see it happening?
Bit by bit, but accelerating as you. Well, I mean, first it's about having conversations with people and trying to frame the ideas. But I think going back to what we said at the beginning, I think if you made real progress on, for instance, unfortunately we undid this progress, but the progress on the child tax credit that was done at the beginning of this administration in the last COVID bill cut child poverty in half in America. One piece of legislation instantly cut child poverty in half. Now we let that expire, which is insane, but and 1 out of 6 children in America are growing up poor. That's an amazingly effective piece of legislation that, by the way, when you cut child poverty in half, you are absolutely adding much more than whatever that costs to GDP 20 years from now than what you're spending to end child poverty. So if we get some chunks of these steps forward together, I think they will create positive momentum and feedback loops on each other that will help people see the value of that. And people will believe government is good when government does good things.
And I think if you just even look at the investment section of this book, you're going to get a lot of concrete examples of what Dan is talking about.
Well, good luck with that.
Thank you for a very illuminating discussion. It was interesting to hear the owner refer to the political morass we are in as depraved. I have not heard that word before, but it totally resonates with me.
He calls it unhinged in the book.
Yeah, I think it's irredeemable, irrevocable, whatever. I mean, it's a pretty hopeless situation. But the thing is, when pundits talk about the mess, they say, okay, in the 18th century, we had such and such problem, we came out of this. And then some other part of time, people like John Meekin and all have said that. And this too shall pass. The problem is, are we learning? After 2 centuries, we seem to be making the same mistakes again and again. Okay. It's nice to see that you're hopeful. Most of the people I speak to, including my family, they dismiss me outright. You said, you're a pessimist, get a life, all that kind of dismissive kind of attitude. But honestly, we can't call ourselves USA. It's a misnomer. We are not the United. We are not one nation. This has been happening for a long time. What makes a nation is some common social values. We don't seem to have that. And my thinking on this is, and I'll pose this thing to you, I think Mr. Biden, when he took office, 2 weeks after the worst assault, the insurrection,
it was on my birthday.
And instead of saying this is not who we are and all that glib talk he gave, he should have appointed a blue ribbon commission of the best minds in this country, go into every single problem and say, okay, we are going to pose it to the people. If you want to stay united, this is what you have to do. Otherwise, let's start talking about 2 separate nations. It's a very difficult task, but I'm saying there's no point continuing this way. There's nothing going to be done for 2 years. Everyone is impeaching the other party. The next time there'll be. So that's my thing to you. Shouldn't we do something like that? Have a blue ribbon come in. I know Nixon did something like that when he took office.
I don't have a lot of confidence in a blue ribbon commission being able to persuade people. I agree with the diagnosis that we have a real challenge. I guess I think that the reason that so much of the challenges with identity that we have right now, the fragmentation of American identity, is deeply connected to people's fears about the decline of American power in the world, to people's dissatisfaction with an economy that is manifestly unfair and a political system that has unfairness built into it, to the lack of confidence people have that their children will live a better life than they've lived. And so I think if we start working on solving some of those problems, that is the way to get to people believing in the possibility of an American identity. And one of the things I say in the book is that what we're trying to do right now, you mentioned that we're having the same problems over and over again. We're actually on the cusp of, this is a problem that we've never solved before. We never had a united American identity that was open and available to every American. If we solve the identity problem, which I say is the hardest one, and it's obviously tightly linked, we will be the only advanced democracy in the world that really does have an identity that is the basis for a liberal democracy that is pluralistic, multi-ethnic, and where it is available in principle to any human being on the face of the earth. That's never been done before. It would be an enormous moral achievement. I'm excited by the prospect of that. When the last time we tried to make a major shift in American identity as a nation was arguably Reconstruction. And we know what happened. The backlash actually took over. It's our job to make sure that if there's a backlash right now, that we are doing everything we can to argue for the alternative course.
Yeah, I know, I understand why you're not very confident about blue ribbon commissions, but I see that as an alternative to the state, this current state continuing, and we end up in a violent war
I'm an institutionalist, but I don't think most Americans are institutionalists right now. And so my skepticism is not on the quality of the ideas, but on what's going to persuade people that something can be different. And I think what will persuade people that something can be different is for things to be different in their lives.
Yeah. Next question.
Sorry, there's more. I want to make sure we get to the others.
An American military official once famously said that the biggest problem faced by the world is overpopulation. Can you comment on that?
That is something that has been a perennial assertion, and I don't think has ever been borne out, because usually technology advances fast enough that actually standards of living on average go up, even as world population has gone up. So I don't personally subscribe to any kind of Malthusian panic. I think actually there's a much stronger argument that one of the challenges that America faces in the next 50 years is convincing enough Americans that it's worth investing in America's future by having children than the alternative. I think a shrinking population for a country like ours is a much bigger threat than a growing population. And in fact, one of the reasons, to take another issue that we haven't talked about, that is usually argued on the left in a social and economic justice frame, which is immigration and how we treat immigrants. We should see immigration as a strategic necessity. We actually need more Americans in order to be successful. So I don't see that as one of the top threats that we face.
We talk about the self-interests of individual countries. Do you think the authority that we're going to be handing off to next would be global, aided by artificial intelligence? And do you think this is the inevitable shape of things to come?
Some of my colleagues are here tonight and know that my view on AI right now is to be very careful about offering any answers, because we haven't actually figured out what the questions are. So I don't know how AI is going to affect global governance. I think it is unlikely. I do not worry about world government, because I can't imagine how we would get there. I think it's much more likely that we're going to continue to see these kind of messy, complex, what I call constellations of cooperation, but different overlapping efforts where there is international cooperation of subgroups of the international community that take on the hard work of solving the world's problems.
And if there is global government,
I think
there's more questions.
Yeah, we
sorry.
just have time for a couple more questions.
All right. I'm just going to ask about we lose our right to vote.
The last couple questions, and then I'm going to end with a question.
Thanks for coming. So I'm sort of like a Bush 41 conservative, very moderate, and I'm
lost
politically, like
homeless.
John Meacham's book was really inspirational to me growing up. But what do you think we have to do to bring that Republican Party back to the center? Is it even possible? And also, you talk about fairness. I look at like a governorship like Bill Haslam's in Tennessee. Like, do you think conservative thought has any role to play in sort of this conversation of how to create a better economy?
I mean, absolutely. Conservative thought is arguably the foundation of political liberalism. I mean, what is thought of as classical conservative thought is strangely discussed as the foundation of liberalism, and because of the way that we Americans use conservative and liberal, that can be very confusing. But yes, conservative thought has a role to play in the national debate, and absolutely, whether you are a Democrat or Republican, personally, you should want there to be a strong and respectable alternative opposing party, because that's how we get good debates over ideas. We want democracy to be a contest of ideas, not a contest of identities, and every Democrat has an interest actually in having a strong Republican Party that is offering the best ideas it can come up with for how to address our common challenges. So I absolutely think there is a need for a value in having people who are define themselves as being conservative in a national debate. And I don't know what the path is for the current Republican Party. I mean, I can offer. Lose a lot. Well, and that is how parties traditionally change, is that you learn lessons at the ballot box. And so I think over time, hopefully lessons will be learned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I live at the epicenter of that identity crisis you're talking about. I live in Rappahannock County in Virginia, where my next door neighbor just put up a flag that Trump is our president, flapping over our road. We're talking about the politicization of even the lowest ranks of government. We're a 7,000 people county, and our board, one of our board of supervisors participated in the January 6th event. And when some of us called for his censure, he brought out 100 people, some of them armed, to demand a First Amendment resolution, because all he was doing was going to listen to Donald Trump give us a lesson on civil discourse or whatever. Sorry, but and I think a big part of the problem that we need to address is rural. We can talk about liberals and Republicans and Democrats and all that, but we're losing it if we want to try to build a better country in the rural areas. Mm-hmm. And that's partly because, frankly, I think both parties have screwed working people for the last 20 or 30 years. The Farm Bill, 85% of it goes to food stamps, most of it in the city. 14+% goes to big ag. Less than 1% goes to
small
rural development. And so I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, how can we address all of these issues without addressing the fundamental one, and that is folks outside of these fancy big cities and bookstores don't buy any of this crap because they've been screwed out the wazoo for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I agree with you. We are at the end of what I would say is a 40 to 45 year long experiment with the idea that if government pulls back and just lets the markets determine things, everything will work out. It hasn't worked out. And we're going to need to change the way we do things. And until we make our economy more fair, and obviously rural areas are feeling in many ways the kind of the threat of consolidation and the effects of economic changes even more with less ability to dynamically respond than urban areas are. So it's acute in rural areas. And until we figure out how to address that, we will not have people in rural areas believing in the idea that government can do good things. And so we have to, again, it's not that our government is broken because the American people are broken. The American people are broken because our government hasn't, American comedy is broken, COMITY is broken. The comedy is doing great because, the situation's so bad. Is broken because we haven't adapted. We haven't adapted to the changed world that we live in. And we can still adapt. Too late, yes, always, but we can still adapt. And if we do, I think we'll see a changed America.
But both parties have been responsible for this.
I didn't.
In rural areas.
I say that in the book. Yeah, this is not a democratic platform. I studiously tried to avoid talking about politicians. I maybe mentioned Biden a couple of times, maybe mentioned Trump a couple of times because I couldn't say what I was trying to say without saying it. But this is not meant to be a partisan tone.
I think my tone has somehow rubbed off on him unintentionally. I just want to end. We have to end, unfortunately, but I just want to end on a hopeful note because I do think you are hopeful. You do say, what is our alternative? What choice do we have but to try to do some of these things? But there are actually concrete things that you cite in the book, and you mentioned the child care tax credit a few minutes ago. So leave us with one really good thing that's happening or one thing that you can see really being possible.
So one concrete example, I think, and I'm using this one because I kind of got scooped by, there's a real challenge with writing a book that is effectively about the zeitgeist because you have to write it really quickly. Otherwise, the zeitgeist changes before the book comes out. Yeah. And one example of this is that, there's an entire chapter on investment. And then, wouldn't you know, Congress that can't do anything goes and passes the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's like this massive hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in the green energy transition, which is exactly the kind of thing that we should be doing. And it's not only the scale of it, it's the sustained nature of it. the fact that it is commitment to spend tens of billions of dollars a year investing in America, investing in American jobs, investing in American adaptation to a changed economy, a changed energy economy, and to do that over 10 years, those kinds of long-term bets are the kinds of things, I shouldn't call it a bet, those kinds of long-term investments or commitments are the kinds of things that our politics is increasingly unable to do, partly because of the back and forth of partisan nature where one party comes in and repeals everything that the last party did. You know, people forget that but for John McCain,
we wouldn't have healthcare.
We would not, we would have ripped up the ACA.
Yeah.
Millions and millions of Americans have healthcare because of the ACA. And not only that, we had already gone through, there were costs associated with adapting to the healthcare system as the ACA. We would have thrown all those costs would have all been lost, and we would have reverted to a system where fewer people had healthcare, but for one Republican senator. And so, you know, we got to get out of this habit of repealing what the other party does, no matter what. You got to assess. I mean, I would blame Democrats. I think there was one progressive thing that Donald Trump did, and he did it out of spite. So, I mean, his motives were wrong, but repealing the state and local tax deduction, which I'm sure is very popular actually with this crowd, but but it's a hugely regressive tax cut for rich people, broadly speaking. And there's no reason why we should be repealing the repeal just because the Republicans did it. The current Congress, there should be no push on the face of it to just automatically undo what the other party does. And if you do that, you can't solve a problem like the climate challenge, because the climate challenge takes a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades of commitment. And if our country is incapable of making decade-long commitments to major policy challenges, we will not be successful. So that's an example of a place where we've been maybe found an unlikely success that I think is the kind of thing that we have to do more of.
And they're little and local. So I mean, our governor in Maryland, Wes Moore, has proposed and then got the legislature to pass a service year for high school graduates. Biden is doing the Climate Conservation Corps. I don't know if that's what it's called, but something like that. So there are these little signs of things happening. The wheels of justice seem to be turning, kind of. I mean, there are. Yeah,
and actually, I'm glad you raised that, and I know we need to end, but I do talk a little bit about national service in the book, and one of the points I made is that I wrote my dissertation about effectively conscientious objection. So I'm committed to the idea that we should not have a draft. But one of the things that we lost when we lost universal military service is that one half of our country, it happened to be the half that, because of sexism, is the most powerful half, had a common experience where they were working alongside somebody from another state who they were a city kid working next to somebody who grew up on a farm, et cetera. And if you want to ask, how do you get patriotic empathy?
Right, that's it.
Part of it is by knowing something about each other. And there's a whole conversation about the collapse of news and all the rest of it. But I think that I'm enthusiastic about innovations in national service, in part because I think it can provide us a basis for knowing each other better.
Yeah,
and being more empathetic to people who don't share our other aspects of our
Well,
identity.
I can't believe we've talked all this time. We didn't hit on a really major topic, which was, of course, part of what you've worked on in government, which is human dignity, the quest for human dignity. We didn't get to that. We didn't get to immigration. See, there's a lot of stuff in this book we didn't get to. The book is great. I really hope you all read it. It's so smart, but it's so clear. And it's a roadmap. I mean, I think, sure, maybe parts of it are naive. I wouldn't even say that. Idealistic. But we got a grasp for something, and Dan does a great job of giving us the path forward. So thank you so much for coming. Thank all of you for coming. There are copies of the book up front if you need, holiday gifts or friends and neighbors who should read this. And Dan will be right here signing the book for those of you who would like signed copies. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.